For over 1,000 years, Constantinople had been that city. The one with walls so legendary they felt less like architecture and more like a polite suggestion to invading armies. You can try. Empires rose, empires collapsed, entire dynasties came and went, and those walls just stayed there, quietly doing their job. Invaders showed up confident. They left humbled, sometimes embarrassed, occasionally broke. By the mid-15th century, though, the city was still standing, but barely breathing. Constantinople was no longer the glittering heart of an empire. It was more like an expensive heirloom everyone pretended was still valuable because admitting otherwise felt uncomfortable. The population had shrunk. The treasury was empty. The army was a patchwork of locals, foreign mercenaries, and optimism. Across the water, however, optimism had upgraded into something far more dangerous. A young Ottoman sultan, smart, ambitious, and aggressively well-funded, was staring at those same walls and thinking a very different thought. Not "those are impressive," more like "those are outdated." And unlike the long list of rulers before him, he brought something new to the conversation: cannons. Big ones. Experimental ones. The kind that made medieval walls suddenly feel negotiable. From the outside, this still looked like a classic story of heroic defense. A small, ancient city holding out against overwhelming odds. The kind of tale history usually loves. And for weeks, that's exactly what happened. The walls were hit. They cracked. They were repaired. Again and again. Day after day. Night after night. And yet, despite the cannons, despite the numbers, despite the pressure, Constantinople was still standing. Which makes what happened next deeply uncomfortable. Because in the end, the city that survived centuries of sieges, superweapons, and imperial ambition didn't fall because the walls failed. It fell because someone forgot to lock a door. So how did the most fortified city on Earth lose everything to a gate no one was worried about? To understand why any of this seemed reasonable at the time, you have to zoom out a little and squint, just enough to see the logic without noticing the cracks. Constantinople wasn't arrogant. It was tired. The city had survived by outlasting its problems, not solving them. And for centuries that strategy had worked remarkably well. When you live behind walls that have humiliated every major army since late antiquity, confidence becomes muscle memory. Inside the city, the leadership wasn't delusional. They knew the numbers were bad. They knew help from Western Europe was more wish than plan. But they also knew the walls, the narrow straits, and the long tradition of attackers eventually giving up. History, after all, was on their side. Or at least it usually was. Outside the walls stood a ruler who had studied that history obsessively and concluded it needed an update. He wasn't reckless. He was methodical, patient, willing to test, fail, adjust, and try again. If you enjoy stories where history walks confidently toward a decision that seems reasonable right up until it isn't, go ahead and let the algorithm know. A like, a comment, even a quiet subscription helps more than medieval empires ever realized. Because at this point, everything still made sense. And that's what made what followed so effective. Once the siege properly began, it settled into a strange rhythm, part medieval warfare, part exhausting routine. Cannons thundered during the day, shaking the ground and everyone's nerves. At night, the defenders went back to work, patching walls like a city crew fixing potholes after an unusually aggressive storm. The walls would crack. The walls would hold. Everyone involved slowly learned the schedule. The massive cannons were impressive, but they weren't magic. They overheated. They misfired. Sometimes they exploded, which was awkward for the people standing nearby. Even when they worked slowly. Fire. Wait. Reload. Fire again. It gave the defenders time, just enough, to believe this could go on longer than the attackers could afford. And for a while, that belief wasn't wrong. At sea, the city still had one crucial advantage: the Golden Horn. A heavy chain stretched across the harbor entrance, blocking enemy ships like a medieval "do not enter" sign. The defenders watched the Ottoman fleet bob uselessly outside it and allowed themselves a rare moment of optimism. If the sea stayed closed, the city could still breathe. That optimism lasted right up until the morning they woke up and saw enemy ships inside the harbor. Not sailing in. Sitting there. Calmly. Casually. As if they'd always belonged. During the night, the Ottomans had done something no one thought was worth planning for. They hauled dozens of ships overland, sliding them on greased logs behind neutral territory, bypassing the chain entirely. It was one of those ideas that sounds ridiculous until it works, and then sounds obvious in hindsight. By sunrise, the defenders weren't just surrounded. They were flanked by their own sense of disbelief. From that point on, the siege became personal. Fireships were launched. They failed. Tunnels were dug beneath the walls. Counter-tunnels were dug in response. Sometimes they collapsed. Sometimes they met underground, resulting in brief, panicked encounters nobody had trained for. It was a contest of patience, improvisation, and who could stay awake the longest. Meanwhile, morale began doing what morale always does under pressure, slipping quietly, then all at once. Omens didn't help. A lunar eclipse turned the moon a troubling shade. A strange fog rolled through the city one night and refused to leave. In a deeply religious society, this felt less like weather and more like a message. The attackers noticed. They offered terms. Surrender now, and lives and property would be spared. It was, on paper, a practical offer. The kind that makes sense if you're tired, outnumbered, and running out of options. It was refused. Not out of arrogance, exactly. More out of identity. This was Constantinople. The city didn't surrender. It endured. That belief had outlived emperors, armies, and centuries of bad news. Letting go of it would have felt stranger than holding on. By late May, the pressure reached its breaking point. 2 major assaults failed, but each one taught the attackers something new. The defenders noticed the change. The pauses between attacks shortened. The cannon fire grew more coordinated. The confidence on the other side stopped looking experimental and started looking settled. Before dawn, on a quiet morning that didn't feel particularly historic, everything finally moved at once. By the time the final assault began, everyone involved was operating on borrowed energy. Sleep had become a rumor. Decisions were made automatically, the way you tie your shoes without remembering each step. The attackers moved in waves, exactly as planned. Noise everywhere. Smoke. Shouting. Confusion layered on top of confusion. From the outside, it looked like the walls were finally giving in through sheer exhaustion. And in many places, they weren't. The defenders were still holding key positions. Ladders went up. Ladders came down. Breaches were contested, sealed, reopened, contested again. It was chaotic, but not catastrophic. If you were standing on the walls at that moment, it probably felt like just another terrible night in a very long series of terrible nights. Then something small happened. Not dramatic. Not loud. No explosion. No heroic charge. Just a door. A minor gate, tucked into a less celebrated section of the wall. The kind of entrance no one worried about, because no one ever needed to. A service passage. A postern gate. Useful for quick movements, patrols, or short sorties. At some point during the chaos, that gate was left unsecured. History has argued about why ever since. A hurried retreat. A miscommunication. A guard too exhausted to notice. A gate opened earlier and never properly closed. Pick your version. They all share the same uncomfortable theme. Nothing intentional, nothing malicious, just a moment where procedure quietly failed. Ottoman scouts noticed. Not because they were looking for a miracle, because they were looking for patterns, and suddenly saw something that didn't belong. An opening where there shouldn't have been one. They slipped inside cautiously at first, then with confidence. Once inside the walls, the logic of the entire defense unraveled almost instantly. The city wasn't designed to be attacked from within. Flags appeared where defenders didn't expect them. Shouts echoed from the wrong direction. Units turned to respond and collided with panic instead. News traveled faster than clarity ever does, and within minutes, rumors had upgraded themselves into conclusions. At nearly the same time, a respected foreign commander was wounded and carried away from the walls. Perfectly understandable. Entirely reasonable. Catastrophic for morale. To exhausted defenders already sensing that something was off, it felt like confirmation. The kind people don't question. What followed wasn't a sudden collapse. It was a sequence of small withdrawals that added up to something irreversible. Lines thinned. Positions emptied. The defense didn't fail everywhere at once. It failed unevenly, which made it worse. Somewhere in the chaos, the emperor himself entered the fighting and disappeared into it. No speeches. No ceremony. Just a man stepping forward into a situation that no longer cared who he was. By the time the sun came up, The walls that had defined the city for over a millennium were still standing. Scarred, cracked, but standing. The city, however, was lost. Not because the walls weren't strong enough. Not because the defenders lacked courage. But because in a system stretched past its limits, a single unsecured detail didn't stay small for very long. By midday, the outcome was no longer in question. The fighting hadn't so much ended as thinned out, the way a storm does when it realizes it's already done enough damage. Organized resistance gave way to scattered pockets of confusion. Orders stopped circulating. Assumptions replaced information. The city that had survived by coordination and habit finally lost both. When the victorious ruler entered Constantinople, he wasn't looking at a ruin. He was looking at a prize. This mattered. The city had fallen, yes, but it had not been erased. Key structures still stood. The streets still worked. The location was still perfect. The plan had never been destruction. It had been inheritance. That irony landed quietly. For 3 days, chaos followed, as was customary and, grimly, expected. And yet, even here, restraint appeared in unexpected places. Major landmarks were protected. The city was measured, evaluated, and claimed, not simply consumed. Within a remarkably short time, the same ruler who had broken through the walls began rebuilding what he had conquered. The name changed. The skyline shifted. The purpose of buildings evolved. But the city itself did what it had always done. It adapted. Constantinople didn't vanish. It transformed. Elsewhere, the consequences rippled outward. Scholars fled west carrying books, ideas, and habits of thought that Europe hadn't seen in generations. Trade routes shifted. Old assumptions about security collapsed. A city that had been considered permanent suddenly became a cautionary tale. Not because it had been weak, but because it had been just strong enough to trust itself. And that's where the story gets uncomfortable in hindsight. Because when people later tried to explain how an ancient capital fell, they didn't point first to the cannons, or the numbers, or the geopolitics. They pointed to the gate. The small one. The forgettable one. The one no one bothered to worry about. Whether the story is perfectly accurate almost doesn't matter. It survived because it felt true. 1,000 years of planning, engineering, and confidence undone not by a grand failure, but by an overlooked detail at exactly the wrong moment. History tends to work that way. It rarely collapses in a single, dramatic mistake. It erodes through systems pushed slightly past their limits, through routines followed a little too automatically, through assumptions that worked for so long no one remembered why they existed in the first place. The walls didn't fail. The strategy didn't fail. The people didn't suddenly become foolish. The system simply reached a point where one small error was enough. And once that happens, history doesn't explode. It just keeps going. When you step back far enough, the fall of Constantinople stops looking like a shocking disaster and starts resembling something almost familiar. Not inevitable. History is rarely that neat, but recognizable. A long-running system, refined over centuries, finally encountering a version of reality it was never optimized for. The city had done everything right, at least according to its own internal logic. It invested in walls because walls had always worked. It trusted routines because routines had always held. It believed that endurance itself was a strategy, because for 1,000 years, endurance had been enough. None of those assumptions were foolish. They were reasonable, sensible, proven, right up until they weren't. On the other side, the conqueror didn't win because he was reckless or lucky. He won because he kept applying pressure in new ways, testing the edges of a system built for repetition, not adaptation. When the cannons stalled, he waited. When the ships were blocked, he moved them. When the walls resisted, he looked for everything the walls didn't cover. And eventually, he found a door no one was watching anymore. That's the part history quietly repeats. The most consequential failures rarely arrive announced. They slip in through neglected corners, outdated assumptions, and details everyone agreed were too minor to matter. No single decision dooms an empire, but enough reasonable decisions, stacked without revision, can leave a system perfectly prepared for yesterday. Constantinople didn't fall because people stopped caring. It fell because caring had become automatic, because success had hardened into habit, because vigilance, once a conscious effort, had slowly turned into background noise. And that's why this story still lingers. Not as a warning shouted across centuries, but as a low, persistent echo. A reminder that systems don't collapse when they're weakest. They collapse when they're most comfortable, when they trust themselves just enough to stop checking the locks. Somewhere, right now, there's a gate no one's thinking about. And history, as always, is very patient.